So once again, welcome everybody. We're going to get started here in a couple of minutes. Thank you for your patience. We're going to give some time for people to get in and then we'll get started. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know that there are still people hopping in, but we really want to get to this amazing workshop. We have Eric Ward joining us from the Western State Center. He's an executive director there. He has over 25 years working in racial equity training, and he is bringing his training to us today for us to learn and take information forward. And he loves soccer, so he's definitely one of us. But without further ado, Eric Ward, everybody.
Such a pleasure. Thank you, everyone. It's so good to be with you today. And I want to thank you all for joining me. My name again is Eric Ward. I'm a longtime civil rights organizer here in the United States, a racial justice activist who, and I've been around for, I'm old now. Now my hair is gray, but there was a time when my hair was not so gray. That I moved from Long Beach, California to Eugene, Oregon. And while in Eugene, Oregon, I became involved in community organizing. And it was particularly in the midst of the anti-apartheid movement and the rise of hate groups here in the Pacific Northwest. Eventually, I moved to Chicago, where I found my team, the Chicago Fire. And in Chicago, I was able to work nationally with immigrant rights organizations who were facing hate crimes and hate attacks. Tonight, I want to really walk folks through the story of rethinking equity. And this is not a conversation on the white nationalist movement. That is really the work that Western State Center is most focused on. At Western State Center, which is based here in Portland, we work with communities and leaders around the country to strengthen their ability to advance racial and gender equity in the United States. It is our understanding that the best way to defend those forms of equity is through strong participatory democracy, and that democracy is under threat by the rise of a white nationalist movement that seeks to create an all-white ethno-state in the United States. But with that said, it's important for us to understand that hate groups don't come into our communities bringing racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, transphobia, and other forms of bigotry with them, that they simply organize the bigotry that already exists. I often share a story that occurred in Portland about 4 summers ago now. And it was in the midst of a large white nationalist incursion and march in Portland. And I remember this one moment where there was an alt-right activist who was being harangued by this guy with the camera. And you know that guy with the camera, you've seen him before. And the guy with the camera in whatever city you're in, but this was here in Portland, had the camera in the face of this white nationalist activist. He was screaming at this white nationalist activist, "Why are you here in Portland, Oregon? No one wants you here, right? All these protesters don't want you here. The mayor doesn't want you here. Why are you here?" And this white nationalist organizer said something that I think all of us should pay attention to. He responded to the guy with the camera and he said, "Yes, I've heard you don't want us here. But the fact of the matter is," he went on to say, "that Portland is a city with a shrinking Black population by both percentage and whole number." He then said to the guy holding the camera, "You can say you don't want us here, but the fact of the matter is that you are doing something we could never get away with. You are actually disappearing the Black population." That was his response. In short, he was calling the rest of us hypocrites. At a time when the white nationalist narrative is so dominant, it is important that we don't respond with hypocrisy, but that we begin to build a real alternative in terms of what America could be, what our communities can be, what our clubs can look like, what the world of soccer can look like inside of our country, inside of our neighborhoods. These are things that we can affect each and every day. There are lots of myths around racial equity. One of the myths is that it takes hours and hours, if not a lifetime, to understand. That is a myth largely perpetrated by folks who have made lots of living off of race equity in America. This is not one of those trainings. The tools that I'm providing today come from an organization called Race Forward. Race Forward is a national organization that advances race equity in America. One of the things that Race Forward tells people each and every day, that learning equity, particularly race equity, is not rocket science. Each of us can do so. All of you will be able to take some of these tools and put them into play as soon as you leave this workshop. And I encourage you to do so. I encourage you to look at these skills, not as something that is far off the radar, but things that can be deployed immediately. It's so important for us to advance around the issue of racial equity. Without overcoming racial inequality in America, we will be unable to advance a vision of an America that can move forward together. Let's move first to objectives. Next slide. Here are the things that we will be looking at today as we begin this work. The first is we will provide a basic understanding, or I will, of key concepts central to advocating for race equity. We will look and understand and how we address implicit bias. We will look at being a stronger advocate for racial equity and what that takes. and you will have a chance to practice or at least hear communications techniques for navigating resistance for change. What this workshop isn't, though, is it isn't a grievance workshop. At Race Forward, we believe that it is incompatible to address both grievances around racial inequality and systems of racial inequality at the same time. That there needs to be spaces provided for both. There are those who have been the victims of racial inequality in our communities, right? In our sports clubs, and in the places where we work and live each and every day. Those grievances are very real, and they're grievances that must be addressed. However, addressing individual grievance is not the same as shifting systems. And at the end of the day, it is our role to shift grievances. To shift grievances means first addressing the systems that promote inequality in our society. Next slide. Racial inequality, I don't think I need to speak to folks, is very real. It exists in education, jobs, housing, arts, culture, equitable development, environment, criminal justice, and health. It exists in nearly every indicator. I could spend the next hour talking about the different disparities in race, but I'll make a really clear one. One example is COVID-19, the pandemic that is raging across the United States. Over 400,000 Americans have now succumbed from COVID-19 in just the last 11 months. But racial disparity plays a role there as well. Currently in the United States, 1 out of every 750 African Americans and 1 out of every 750 indigenous people has now died from COVID-19 in the last 11 months. I'm going to say that number again because it's quite significant. 1 out of every 750 Black people in the United States has died in just the last 11 months, just from COVID-19. But what we know about racial inequality in America is that it's not just the virus that is killing people and killing Black and indigenous communities. It is also racial disparity in the healthcare system, in the ways that doctors and other health experts respond to what is happening in Black and indigenous communities. It is in the way that we refuse to practice consent that places Black and indigenous people in further danger. Racial disparity plays out in our lives each and every day. It is all around us. You can Google the data online, but if you cannot see it happening around you, there is no data or enough data in this world to prove to you otherwise. But I encourage folks to look and observe at the racial disparity that plays out. I often refer to folks and tell stories about Starbucks coffee. Folks may remember Starbucks and the racial discrimination that took place at a Starbucks in the Northeast of the United States that spread the protest around Starbucks around the country. I remember when Starbucks decided to engage in trying to create more awareness amongst their employees around how not to promulgate anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism. I remember going to Starbucks once or twice after that had happened. And I remember walking in and thinking, oh my God, this is, they really did an amazing job here, right? I can't believe how well I've been treated here in the Starbucks. And then I remember a white colleague telling me, actually, Eric, this is how I'm treated every time I go into Starbucks. Think about this in your day-to-day life. If you can begin to observe racial disparity, you'll begin to understand how to disrupt it. And what you will have today are the tools. One of the problems, though, that we'll get to right away in terms of dealing with racial disparity is coming to solutions. We often come together around a problem and we say, you know, we need to solve this problem of race or racism in America. So we gather in our clubs, or we gather in our bars, or we gather in our business or our household, and we begin to discuss the problem. Inevitably, we always come to the same solutions that don't often work. We often try to solve the problem through mediation rather than systems change, rather than changing administrative rules. It is this return to the same solutions that often gets us stuck in a cycle of disparity. I want to show briefly how that works. So I want folks to kind of grab, if you have a pencil or paper, if you have your computer open, we're going to do just a little arithmetic. And I'm going to have you do just a few things. And Rebecca, you can hold on this slide. Don't advance just yet. Okay, now that if you have your phone open or something you can write on, I want you to think of a number between 1 and 10. Now that you have that number between 1 and 10, I want you to take that number and times it by 9. Now that you have the solution to that, if it's a 2-digit number that you just came up with, I want you to add them together. So for example, if your number is 32, you would add 3 plus 2, and your new number would be 5. If you came up with 12, you would add 1 plus 2, and your new number would be 3. Do that now. Now that you have your new number, I want you to subtract it by 5. Now that you have your new number, I want you to convert that number to a letter. So for instance, A would be 1, B would be 2, C would be 3, etc. Now that you have that letter in your head, I want you to think of what that letter is. Imagine it. Now I want you to tell me the first country that comes to mind that starts with that letter. You have that country. Now I want you to think of the last letter in that country's name, and I want you to think of the first animal that comes to mind that starts with that last letter. Now that you have that animal, I want you to think of the last letter in that animal's name, and I want you to think of a fruit that starts with that last letter. Rebecca, advance the slide so folks can see the steps to that again. Okay. I can't see you now because I have the slides up. But right now, I want you to put into the text, into the chat, what was the country you came up with? What is the animal you came up with? And what is the fruit? I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to do that. Okay. I'm going to take a guess. I'm looking at things, but I'm going to say I picked the most popular answer. Rebecca, advance the slide. I can see folks chat, and what I can tell you is most of you came up with a kangaroo eating an orange in Denmark. The next popular one was Dominican Republic, right? I'll tell you all something right now. If the letter you didn't come up with was D, It's because you did your math wrong, but it's okay. It was moving quite quickly. It's a trick, partly. And it's a trick partly because I drove you to the letter D. So you may be sitting there right now thinking, well, Eric, you tricked us into coming up with the most likely answer. And Rebecca, advance the slide. Indeed, you might think that is correct because when I ask this question, it doesn't matter whether there are 10 people in a room or 1,000 people in the room, 70 to 90% of folks will come up with a kangaroo eating an orange in Denmark. How do we know that? How can we predict that? Is it a trick? Well, the truth is that that portion is not a trick. Next slide. In fact, even though most of you came up with Denmark and the Dominican Republic, there are actually more than 1 million possibilities in answering that and solving that riddle. There are over 1 million, but 70 to 90% of folks will come up with the kangaroo eating an orange in Denmark. Why? Some of that has to do with socialization. We notice in the southeast of the United States, more people are likely to say the Dominican Republic. If you have folks who are in the Southwest, particularly in California, you'll start to see the word Kiwi come up, right? We see this all the time, and this is just socialization. It has to do with the way we are raised in a society in unconscious ways, ways that help us lead, right, to a specific answer. But how many possibilities do we miss each and every day? This is one of the things that racism does to all of us. While this equation certainly wasn't racist, and neither were any of the answers, racism prevents us from tapping into possibilities. It taps us from moving forward as a society together because it restricts what we can tap into in terms of creativity, knowledge, and solutions. Each and every day, this country and our society loses out. People of color lose their humanity, but everyone loses from racism. A recent study produced by Citigroup showed that the cost of racism in America is significant, and that over the next 5 years, due to racial discrimination in the economy, the United States will lose over $5 trillion. Imagine how much this society needs that $5 trillion right now, at a time when over 17 million Americans are out of work. People have lost hope. We should understand that all of us, regardless of our skin color, regardless of our background, have skin in the game in confronting racism. Let me stop really quick and see if there are any questions before we move on.
There are no questions at this time.
Perfect. Then we're going to go to the next slide. In this moment in time, we have to ask ourselves the question, is America possible? Vincent Harding, a longtime civil rights strategist, was the first to ask this question in a series of essays that he authored. You may not know Vincent Harding, but you probably know his work. He was the speechwriter for Martin Luther King Jr. and wrote some of Martin Luther King Jr.'s seminal speeches, including the last speech that he gave from the mountaintop. Vincent Harding has posed the question, is America possible? I assume that for those of us who do work around race equity, that we do believe that America is possible, one that is built in abundance rather than in spaces of exclusion, right? In scarcity. That the idea of an abundant America is made real each and every day through the struggles of people in our society and through those who join them, who understand that in fact, it is not about dividing up slices of pie, but about building an efficient and large factory that can make an abundant amount of pie. It's a simplified version, but it's a version that is built with hope. There's a caveat here. If you don't carry hope, you actually cannot fight racism. Fighting racism requires hope. You see it throughout the Black struggle, including today in the Black Lives Matters movement. Those who struggle against racism each and every day are filled with the possibilities of what could be. You hear it in the language of "we shall overcome someday," right? To the idea that Black lives matter, to the idea of moving over the mountaintop, or the idea of the chant, "if you look for me on the bus, I'll be sitting up front," right? It is that hope that continues to drive the idea of a real America, one that is people-centered, accountable, and transparent. But we don't get there with racial inequality blocking the way. So how do we address racial inequality? Next slide. I want to give folks a very easy way of understanding how to disrupt racial inequality and to build racial justice. If you are listening to this and you are excited about building racial justice in your club, in your business, and in your community, you have to start first with shared values. There's too much focus on ideological difference and not enough focus on what are the values that we share in common. We may not agree in terms of our political ideology and how we want the world, but I bet we agree on shared values. The idea that we want safe communities, that we want communities where our neighbors and our families thrive, communities that are healthy, that provide possibilities for our children and for ourselves. By focusing on shared values, you help people begin to visualize what could be. But shared values are not enough on their own. Those shared values have to help people normalize a shared history, an honest history of America. America was built on a system called white supremacy. White supremacy taught that people were superior or inferior based off of their skin color. It taught that the definition of race as a biological definition was real, not just a social construction, which it is. It taught that there was a binary, white people on one end, close to godhood, and Black people on the opposite end. It was built in order to structure our society, structure a society off the genocide and the stolen resources of Native people, the chattel slavery of Black people, and what's not often talked about, the control of sexuality through the control of women in our society. These were the three pillars of white supremacy in America. And it's what allowed the United States to be one of the most powerful countries economically in the world. Now, I want everyone to take a deep breath. That is a shared history. And it's a history we need to normalize. But we also have to understand that none of us were there for the creation of that system. None of us are responsible for that system. We are merely responsible in ensuring that it doesn't carry forward, that instead we move forward through values of inclusion rather than values of exploitation. By acknowledging that history, it doesn't make us weaker as a society or community. It normalizes the history that we have moved through. In fact, when we understand that history we understand how strong we are as a country to be able to push past it to a point where 2021 America is not the same as 1921 America. And it's certainly not the same as 1821 America. It doesn't mean that we don't have ways to go, that there aren't still real issues of race and other forms of bigotry that deny people their humanity. It just acknowledges that this has been an evolving conversation. Democracy itself is evolving, and it's evolving in a way that bends towards the arc of justice. But visualizing and normalizing are just two steps. We also have to have shared relationships. And shared relationships don't come through workshops like this, I hate to tell you. Those shared relationships come from deciding to do things together. We build community across lines of race, but also religion, gender, ethnicity, and even political ideology by doing things together, by building together, rolling up our sleeves and trying to problem solve. Those are the ways that we begin to strengthen relationships with one another. For you see, ultimately, to address racial inequality means building relationships that are more powerful, right, than the division that racism has structured in our societies. It's why, for those listening, that our identity around soccer is so powerful. When you're sitting in a stadium, watching a club play, when you're in that stadium, for a brief moment, at times, your shared love for your club is more powerful than the divisions of race, religion, and gender. We need to understand that that is something powerful that can be built on. That is what it means to organize. Lastly, shared tools. Shared tools are the ways that we operationalize racial justice. It means policies and practices, making things standard so that those who follow behind us can adapt and put those tools into play. It's once that we have those shared tools in play that we start the cycle again. Visualize, normalize, organize, operationalize. When soccer supporters came together from around the country, right, to visualize what it meant to show values of racial justice in stadiums and how to normalize them and how to organize and then how to operationalize them, we saw the power and the potential of that. The shared power in the stadium is critically important. But there's a piece to this that is critically important, and we're going to move to the next slide. To make that circle work, you have to have equity. And equity for racial justice means acknowledging that racial inequality is deep and pervasive in ways that are not always visible to us. And it's not often our fault that it's not visible. We've been socialized for hundreds of years to not recognize them. So while we may not see them, by admitting that they are deep and pervasive, opens up the door to understanding them when others point them out. We also have to understand that racial anxiety is on the rise, and race is often the elephant in the room, the invisible elephant. Demographic change in the United States is creating what is known as demographic anxiety. Demographic anxiety, though, is actually quite natural. I remember the first time that I sat with the Timbers Army. Now, I knew a lot of folks in the Timbers Army, but I didn't know everyone there. And it's not usually where I sit in stadiums. The first time I sat there, I was filled with anxiety. I didn't know folks. I didn't know if folks would welcome me there. right? And as Fernando said, we stand, right? And as I was there, I felt that anxiety. It's natural anxiety. All of us feel that demographic anxiety every time we walk into a room with folks we don't know. That is demographic anxiety. However, there are those in our society who have told people that that anxiety is an existential threat, not something natural, something they need to fight against. We in the racial justice movement often get on people for feeling that anxiety and sometimes expressing it. Neither of those responses work. We have to understand that demographic anxiety is just a fact of life, and it's something that can be managed. Put me in the timber section now, and you will see me drinking beer, hanging out, standing, and having a great time. It's because I'm exposed to the environment over and over again. This is why we take on issues of equity, because it breaks down the segregation that prevents us from learning and knowing one another. We do so through learning in an institutional instructional approach, right? Can be used with other areas of marginalization. And what I mean by that is by institutions and by addressing systems, those things can be applied to other areas such as sexism, discrimination against folks with disabilities, etc. We also believe being specific matters. It is not helpful to just say we are against all forms of bigotry. There are all kinds of forms of bigotry in the world. It's important to acknowledge the deep divisiveness that is racism in America. Next slide. So let's get into what is equity, and we can move on to the next slide now. We hear these terms all the time: equity, equality. What is the difference? One of the ways that I like to explain it is this. If you've ever been in a stadium and you've had to go to the restroom, right, particularly at the half, one of the things you find are very long lines. Now, I want everyone to close your eyes. If you've ever been to a concert, even if you have not yet been to a soccer match, which you will correct soon in the next 2 years. But if you never have, I want you to think of a play you've been to or to a concert. I want you to think about that time between bands or at the halftime, right? When you've gone to the restroom. Close your eyes and imagine it. Long lines. You usually see men in one line and women in the other. Very binary. But for a second, I want you to focus on who typically has the longest line, and how long is that line, and how long does it take that line to move? Now, there's an equal number of women and men's restrooms. So isn't that equity? No, it's equality. Equality presumes some type of fairness, right? 50% here, 50% there. The problem with equality, though, is that equality doesn't always advance the needs of everyone. So, for instance, you might sit back and say, well, those who are women, right, they just have to, they have the same number and they just have to wait longer. But for those of you who are in the men's line that moves much quicker, what are you doing when you come out of the restroom? Usually you find yourself waiting as well. Equality is important as a value. Equity is the practice. Equity would say, in fact, there need to be more women's restrooms, or in fact, all gender restrooms that anyone can use regardless of gender identity or expression. That would actually save a lot of time as people could move through the bathrooms very quickly. But not only that, these stadiums lose out as well. It's less things you are buying, right? But the community loses out because it's less time that you're interacting. Equity, we have to understand, doesn't take away from others. It actually adds to the value of all of our lives. Next slide. We often hear the words diversity, inclusion, and equity. What do they mean? In short, diversity is about quantity. It's the number of people and the diversity of those people that you have in a room. But diversity is not inclusion. You can have a diverse fan base, but if those individuals are not part of the participation across identity and culture, you're not getting inclusion, which means you're not getting the million solutions of the kangaroo eating an orange in Denmark. But diversity and inclusion aren't the same as equity. Without equity, without the policies and the practices and the procedures, diversity and inclusion can ebb and flow depending on who happens to be around. Equity brings justice. It makes sure that you are constantly relooking at outcomes to understand if they are equitable and how to adjust them. Equity ensures generational change in addressing racial justice. Next slide. I want everyone to think a little bit about race and racism. Again, we have to understand that addressing racial justice is not merely about individual action and behavior, that it's a system that has been built over time that has conditioned all of us. Think about your earliest experiences with race. How racially diverse was your neighborhood growing up? What messages did you get about race from living there? When was the first time you had a teacher of a different race? How often did that occur? When was the first time you had a teacher of the same race? And how often did that occur? If you ask that question amongst diverse audiences, the answers are very different. For me, the first time I had a teacher of a different race was the first time I went to school, right? And it occurred all the time. When was the first time I had a teacher of the same race? Well, that was sometime in like 12th grade, 11th or 12th grade. How often did it occur? Twice in my entire time in public school, right? How racially diverse was my neighborhood growing up? It was really diverse, right? The messages I got about race, right, were that we had Black communities and we had Latino communities, right? And that we weren't welcomed in communities that weren't that. We all have our early experiences, and lifting up those experiences help us understand how we've been socialized, that it's not just about our individual behavior, but it's not just about socialization. Next slide. We've learned more about the human brain in the last 15 years, right, than the entire history of humanity before that combined. Next slide. One of the things we know is that the unconscious mind is actually more powerful than the conscious mind. And that within there are schemas, and I'm sure there's scientists on here right now, right? And these are the frames through which our brains help us understand the world and navigate. We sort things into categories. We create associations and we fill in gaps. I often talk about the first time I moved up to Oregon when I was young. And I remember my friends asking me, I grew up in Southern California in Long Beach. And my friends asked me if I wanted to come up to Oregon. Two of them were going to the University of Oregon. And these were close friends. I mean, we were running partners in high school. And I looked at them with the love a friend has for another. And I said to them, hell no. Why would I ever move to Oregon? And I'm pretty sure I said Oregon, because I didn't even know how to pronounce Oregon. If you could have looked in my mind's eye right? If you could have lifted up my brain and looked in, what you would have saw immediately in my head was San Francisco, a lot of trees, and the Space Needle, which wasn't even in Oregon, but in Seattle, Washington. Why did I have that image? I remember asking my friends, I'm saying this embarrassingly now, and I know it's going to come back and haunt me. I remember asking my friends then if Oregon had running water, if it had electricity, did it have MTV? Now that tells you it was the 80s. And did it have McDonald's? I thought Oregon looked something akin to Little House on the Prairie. Again, why? Well, I had never been to Oregon, and I didn't know anyone from Oregon, and I never learned about Oregon in school. And so because I didn't have it, I began to fill in gaps with myths and stereotypes. And I began to create associations. I began to sort things into categories about what LA was like and what Oregon was like. And for me, Oregon looked like that Little House on the Prairie. But the fact of the matter is that I was relying on stereotypes because I didn't have information. That's how our brains work, and it's not a bad thing necessarily until we stick to those stereotypes, even when presented with the facts. Fact. We know white people are more likely to face physical injury from folks of their own race, right? But yet, we see each and every day white folks who are fearful of Black crime. That is when fact clashes into categories and associations. It is our inability to deal with those categories and associations and to fill in gaps with actual information that lead to prejudice. When you couple that with the socialization of hundreds of years of white supremacy, you come up with a perfect storm. But it gets more complicated because the unconscious mind and how we think is important. Next slide. How we think is this: humans need meaning. For those of us who have been in the pandemic for 11 months, we now understand even more intimately the importance of individual and collective meaning. But only 2% of that emotional cognition is available consciously. Racial bias tends to reside in the unconscious network. It is in the place where we actually can't tap into it as readily as we think. And one of the interesting pieces is that when under pressure, when we are most under pressure, the unconscious mind tends to unlock its racial bias. One of the surest ways that you can get folks to act in ways, to say things that are biased, is to actually begin accusing them of racism. Study after study has shown that when folks even hear the word racial equity, racial bias, they begin to exhibit unconscious bias that is unlocked in their networks. It's why the accusatory approach, no matter how justified, doesn't tend to address racism as a systemic problem. It may make me feel validated that I spoke my mind, but it almost ensures that the person listening to me has now retreated into their unconscious mind. Let's give an example of how that stress works. We're going to do an exercise, and switch to the next slide, Rebecca. So you are going to guess what color are the lines of text. So Rebecca, put up the very first one. So if you can see, the color of the line of that text is blue. Next one. The color, right? Don't look at what it says. Look at the color. The color is red. So now you are going to pick up the rest and you're going to try to say them out loud on your own. You're on mute, but I want you to just start saying them. We're going to start. It does look a little bit purple to me too. And so apology to folks who have visual disabilities, but I'm gonna let you do the best you can under here. It looks a sort of purple to me as well. That's okay, Dan. I think it's an important point. Thank you for raising it. So folks, are you ready? 3, 2, 1, go. Now, take a deep breath. What most of us probably started doing was reading what the text said instead of the color. It probably got more stressful as you got towards the end, right? This is what happens when we are talking about race in America. The stress starts to build. We start to get confused about what we are saying and what we mean. We start to second guess ourselves. This is the impact of the unconscious mind onto the conversation of race. But I want to tell folks something. There's a way to overcome this. And the way to overcome it is through practice. Just like I said, how other folks are impacted by demographic anxiety, and the response to that demographic anxiety to help them manage it is to keep putting them in the space. The same way that you, with a person who has a fear of flying, the way they overcome that fear of flying is not by not flying, but by repeatedly flying, right? It doesn't mean the fear, the anxiety goes away. It means that we begin to build muscles, right, to manage that anxiety so it doesn't interfere with our lives, with the values that we care about. It also raises the question of an important conversation. Next slide. It tells us that there are two types of bias that play out in society. There's explicit bias, which is expressed directly. These are the racist slurs that we might hear or chants. This is the graffiti on the wall. This is a person, saying something that is just clearly, right, a sign in the window of an apartment building. We don't rent to fill in the blanks. People are usually aware of the bias and they operate consciously. But as I said, that is not where most bias resides. Most bias resides implicitly. It's expressed indirectly. Well, people of color must not love soccer. Or it's the unaware of bias that operates subconsciously. What does it mean for folks of color to leave a soccer game at night, right, and attempt to make their way home? Do they feel as safe as white folks who are also soccer supporters? An example is a property manager doing more criminal background checks on African Americans than whites, which we know happens each and every day. It is this area of implicit bias where we need to begin to focus our attention. It doesn't mean that we don't address and manage the explicit bias, but it means the implicit bias is the one that really undercuts much of what we are trying to achieve. Next slide. Here's a great example of implicit bias. There's a story about a orchestra that was attempting to hire women, right, for the orchestra. And so they brought in, a huge kind of hiring pool, and they interviewed folks and they had folks practice. And at the end of those interviews, what happened is most of the folks left were men candidates, even though consciously the attempt was to try to diversify the diversity of the orchestra. They didn't know what to do. So someone came up with an idea there, right? Again, with the new possibility. They said, let's reopen the hire, but this time, let's place all the candidates behind screens so we can't see their gender. When they did that, the percentage of female new hires for orchestral jobs increased from 25 to 46%, right? Why? Because that orchestra and its management figured out how to take unconscious bias out of the equation. And when they removed unconscious bias from the equation, they began to watch diversity and equity grow within their institution. Next slide. We see implicit bias play out all the time. Studies have shown us that white sounding names receive 50% more callbacks than African American sounding names. It's why in many job searches now, people actually remove the names of candidates, right? And where they live off the resumes. They are blind resumes, excuse the word blind, but what I mean is they remove the identification of individuals in order to interrupt unconscious bias. Again, this is proof that all of us can do things to move and advance racial equity through small steps of addressing how unconscious bias impacts much of our decision making. Next. What do we do with this unconscious bias? Well, I have to tell you something. Attempting to suppress that bias, right, can actually increase your prejudice rather than eradicate it. Why? Because it creates more stress. Trying to suppress or deny bias within an institution can do the same thing. It can make folks strengthen their prejudice because they're spending so much time trying not to fall into it. Think about that one time that you really, really focused on not making a mistake. And you probably stressed yourself out so much that you ended up making the mistake. We need to stop suppressing or denying biased thoughts inside of our institutions. We need to openly acknowledge that those biases exist so that we can develop strategic interventions. The last thing we want to say is that we are clubs that practice racial equity. What we want to say is that we are clubs that are advancing racial equity. And we do so by being honest about the challenges that exist. These challenges are opportunities, right? They aren't marks on our clubs, on our entities, on ourselves as individuals. Unless a person is being overtly, explicitly biased, we have to create space to begin to put in systems and processes that don't call people out, but give them structure so that their unconscious bias is less likely to have an impact on others. Next. By implementing policies and protocols that limit opportunities for individual subjective bias to come into play, we are more resistant to implicit bias. Next slide. I want everyone to stop and think. I want you to think of one, you don't have to design it right now. I want you to think of a policy or protocol that you currently know within your institution, your entity, or your community, right? Where considerations of racial equity are built into the way decisions are made, right? When you have those policies in place, you are more likely to come up with a productive, positive outcome. At Western State Center, one example is no less than 51% of our board can be women. No less, sorry, than 51% of our board can be women, and no less than 51% of our board can be Black, right? That always means in our organization, right, that women, right, and Black folks have an assertive voice, right? That their voice shows up in presence, in diversity, which ensures more likely equitable policies. Think about what that might look like in yours. Next slide. An important thing to remember, right? Pairing implicit bias training with institutional action leads to better results than just doing an educational training. Remember, we all have bias. And you can keep advancing through this one. Yeah, there we go. And then the next one, Rebecca, we all have bias, all of us. Studies have shown that even folks of color have bias, but that is not an excuse, right, for those who carry privilege in society to not address their biases. We often hear, well, Black folks or Latinos are biased, so that must just mean racism is okay and I don't have any responsibility. Those who benefit from racism most in American society are white, and they have a responsibility to ensure that that system does not move forward. But all of us have biases. And our biases show up in a study that was done in Oakland, California, a study of educators and how they interacted with Black male students. And what they found is that white educators showed a huge amount of racial bias towards Black male students. But you know what? So did Black educators as well. These are ways that we have been socialized. And we cannot be so quick to call people good or bad because of the ways we've been socialized. The way we move through that is through our own collective understanding and collective work together. Next slide. How do we know when we've achieved racial equity? Well, when race is no longer a determinant of life outcomes. And two, in addressing racial inequity directly, we understand that we improve outcomes for everyone, including white people. Racial equity is both our process and the outcome we seek to achieve. What I mean by this last point is no one should think because we move this work that there's some sudden finish line we're going to cross. It is the process that becomes super important, and so is celebrating the outcomes we achieve along the way. To get here, we need to shift the focus. Next slide. And I want to give folks some real tips here. We need to move from the blame and shame and guilt and grievance culture. We need to move from the blame, shame, guilt, and grievance culture because it's hyper-individualized in a society that is hyper-individual. Blame, shame, guilt, and grievance typically puts one person to carry the burden by saying, look what you have done to me. Look at how you have made me feel. That, as I said before, is an important part of reconciliation, but it is not critical to advancing systemic changes. In fact, it won't help to achieve systemic changes. We have to move to causes, understanding the causes of racial inequality in our institutions, understanding what are the effects of that racial inequality, what are the systems that need to be addressed, and what are the solutions that need to be moved forward. To get there, we have to shift the questions that we ask. Next slide. We do that by moving from who's a racist to the question of what is causing the racial inequity. We need to move from intentions to effects. What did they mean? What was their attitude? As if we could know. To effects. What were the actions? What are the impacts? We need to move from understanding what beliefs made them do it to the systems. What institutions are responsible? What allowed it to take place institutionally? And we need to move from grievances to solutions. From how can we fix what just happened, and usually how can we fix what just happened to me, to what are the proactive solutions and strategies that strengthen my community? These are the ways that we begin to move forward. And to do that, each of us must now begin to pick choice points. Next slide. Choice points are those moments where we get to empower ourselves. It's where we get as individuals to make our power and influence felt. Next. Choice points are avoiding the same old choices and actions, avoiding the same outcomes of inequity, exclusion, and racism. Real choice points look to equitable options and actions, and they advance the conversations around equity, inclusion, and the prevention of racism. How do we get there? Well, we do so, next slide, by looking at key decision-making opportunities that influence outcomes. We look at the cumulative impacts of many small choices instead of waiting for these big decisions that can be made. When we do those two things, we are less likely to replicate the status quo. I'll give you one example. There's one soccer club in Germany who the supporter section decided that all of their prints, right, all of the swag that they created would be printed, right, by folks who were still considered Turkish immigrants in Germany. They decided that they would begin to shift how they utilized their resources in ways that strengthened immigrant businesses in Germany. That was a key decision that took place. And it was a key decision that began to open up the space for a new set of supporters to their club. It was something that they hadn't done before. And it didn't take a lot. They didn't have to run a whole year-long campaign. They simply began to make their administrative choices differently. And they codified it as part of their bylaws and rules. Because of that, they were less likely to replicate the status quos that often get us in trouble, right? One time a year where we do our anti-racism TIFOs and then we get hammered for it and nothing else happens for the rest of the year. They came up with a different decision. Next slide. By having that diversity and inclusion in the room, when you find those solutions that work for the most vulnerable in your communities, you find solutions that work better for everyone. And we can just go back to the non-gendered restroom as a very tangible example of that. Next, we have to avoid some of the frames that block us, right? That racism and racial inequality are things of the past. It usually comes up as, my family didn't own slaves, my family wasn't here. But that's an incomplete answer. Just because your family wasn't here doesn't mean your family doesn't benefit now. And it doesn't mean that you don't benefit now. It doesn't mean you're responsible, again, for what was set up, but we are responsible for the racism and racial inequality that exists now. Next, disparities caused, oh, go back, I'm sorry, one more. Disparities caused by culture and behavior. We often hear poor Black and Latino youth don't do well in school because their families don't value education, right? Or people of color don't move, this is the one I heard in the 80s, people of color don't move up to the Pacific Northwest because they don't like the cold, right? It's amazing the number of excuses that we come up with each and every day to justify racial disparity, right? Oh, people of color must have more policing because they're more criminal, right? These are the roadblocks to having real discussions on race equity. The idea that some group has to be at the bottom, the scarcity model, or that people of color are merely self-segregating themselves isn't true. And the last is reverse discrimination, that somehow programs that bring equity are unfair to white folks. As I said before, inequality in America will cost the United States $5 trillion. I gotta tell you, we should all be clear, not all that $5 trillion impacts communities of color. The impact of racial disparity is very real. Finally, last slide. I want to say when you're thinking about the principles of equity practice, right? Think big, right? And when we say think big, it doesn't mean act big. What we mean is understand that you can advance racial equity. You do not need 20 years of school to do so. You can start today just by thinking through what are the systems that we can begin to change. Be explicit about racial equity. Put it front and center. It's important because racial inequality negatively impacts all of us. Aim for tangible change. Look for those things that can be done that are measurable and identifiable. Engage individuals early. Make sure that you are talking to people across the spectrum, right? Management, right? To employees, to fans, right? To folks you want to be fans, to media, to others. 5, measure and evaluate. Understand that when you measure and evaluate, you will still find disparities in the things that you've done. You think of a story out of Seattle when the court system decided that it wanted to lessen the disparity of young people of color not showing up for court dates and having warrants then put out for their arrest. So they came up with an idea. They decided that they would just start mailing letters to everyone's homes to let them know when their court dates were coming up. So they had the police department start mailing letters to everyone's home. And something happened, amazing. More young people started showing up for the court dates and warrants began to drop. But you want to hear something funny? The disparity between white youth showing up and people of color, young people of color showing up actually grew. More white folks were showing up than youth of color. It actually got worse by percentage for youth of color. So it was an idea that was a good idea, but by measuring and evaluating, they realized that the disparity was increasing. So then they took a step back and tried to figure out why that was. And what they figured out was having a letter come from the police department or from any government entity wasn't a good idea. And that people, because of economic impacts of race, right, were moving. And so they weren't at those addresses that may have been listed. So they finally got a nonprofit organization, a social service agency, to take on that work and to start texting people when it was time for their court dates. And you know what? The disparity almost completely disappeared. So measure and evaluate. I know we only have time for a few questions, but I want to dive in and I want to hear what folks are thinking about what you might do where you are to advance race equity. Thank you. And if you have a question, use the chat. Oh yeah, or the question and answer period. I'm the Luddite when it comes to Zoom. She is good. No questions. Everyone's ready to go.
Oh, we just had one come in.
That's I was gonna let everyone get there. You know what? We can share this slide deck. We'll modify because I know there's a lot of slides in here. We'll modify this deck and share, I think, some of the tools with you all. I also want to share that Race Forward does ongoing online trainings on race equity that incorporate some of this work. And so that is another way to access, but we'll share the slide deck with folks. I think it's good for review, and it's good just to open up the conversation. Yeah, thoughts on when I see the discourse. There's a question about white individuals leaning versus not kneeling in various sports spaces. Look, I think, you know, oh no, I got that, but thank you. Look, I think that there's a lot of back and forth, right? You know, is white athletes kneeling co-optation of Black protest? I've heard that argument. I've also heard folks say that they would love that solidarity from kneeling. You know, I don't think that there is a consensus on this, right? What I would say is one of the ways that it can easily get solved, right, is for players to check in with one another before the game, and it may look different for every club and every team, right? But if folks are having that conversation ahead of time, before it gets stressful, right? Before our unconscious bias starts to come out, right? Because of the stress of the moment. I think that, you know, it's the solidarity that is more important than how that solidarity is shown. And if we understand that it's the value of solidarity that we seek, teams coming together can figure out as players what is the best way for each player to do so. Can I review what can be said and done when challenging someone on implicit bias? Yes. So quickly, what I would just say is the most important piece is, instead of asking the question, is this person a racist, right? Sorry, and I'm trying to get my screen to unstick here. Instead of asking, right, the blame, like you're racist, right? Ask the question, what is causing the racial inequity, right? What is causing this thing to happen? And the way that I kind of think about it a little bit is here in Portland, right? There was a huge surge for a while of what were kind of far right incursions into Portland. They're very violent. Now it's interesting, right, that folks could look at the right wing and say, why are they coming here and causing so much violence? And then you would have racial justice activists who were, you know, marching and then being arrested in big numbers, while you would have paramilitary folks who were walking around with weapons at times, and police, you know, just letting them walk right by. And the question could have been focused on, you know, why are these paramilitary folks bringing weapons into the streets? But I think the real question was, why is there such biased policing towards these two formations, right? And so it shifted the conversation to whether police are racist, to why is this being allowed? What are the systems in place that are making this happen? So that's one. Instead of who's the racist, what's causing the racial inequality? The next is stop wondering people's intentions, right? As we all know, you know, good intentions pave the path to hell, right? And so do bad intentions. You can't guess a person's intention, and focusing on it is a waste of energy. It's more important to say, you know, did this person mean to be bigoted? Isn't as important to, here is what the impact was on our community when this happened, right? And so you take it off of the individual and you put the focus on what happened. The last is prejudice, right? What beliefs, like why do people join the white nationalist movement? You know, why did this person feel like they needed to say something really racist? right? My take is, what are the policies in place that allow someone to walk into a stadium and feel completely comfortable saying or doing something like that? It's more productive to focus on the system than the prejudice. And the last is just around grievance, right? Where possible, right? Grievance needs to be a reconciliation process. It is not a solution, right? Working through a grievance doesn't solve the systemic problem. And I believe we have, because of lots of reasons, we have created a culture of grievance that has completely drowned, right, the focus and the need on systems change. And I could go into detail around why I think grievance is more celebrated. Some of it has to do with unconscious bias. That white folks love the idea of people of color performing, right? And the feeling of that, right? The adrenaline rush becomes addictive, right? And so grievance has been celebrated and accepted, right? In a way that system change is continually challenged. And I encourage all of us to refocus our attention when possible, right, on systems change, understanding that grievance sometimes needs to be addressed. I think we have time for one more question. The use of the P chant. I'm going to guess what that is. I'm going to I'm going to guess that that is implicit bias, right? I don't think I think probably the intent, right? There's no explicit intent, right, to demonize or belittle women, but the unconscious bias that leads us to believe that that is okay, right? Probably is grounded in misogyny. So I'll let folks argue that out, but that's my take on that, is that that's likely an unconscious bias that causes us not to think that that is completely offensive to women. Public shaming has always been a valuable tool in our supporters group. I don't think public shaming is probably that effective. What I think it does is it probably drives people to try to suppress their biases. And I think when people suppress their biases, right, they're more likely to play out in ways. I think instead of public shaming, right, it's about lifting up. What I would argue is we shouldn't be, how do I say this, right? We have to get to a point of trust where we can lift up, where we can lift up challenges that happen in our clubs without it being seen as if we are like the worst people in the world, right? In fact, we aren't the worst people in the world. We are all on here trying to understand how to move forward in terms of race equity. And can I elaborate on how interaction that moves beyond public shaming can do that? Look, you can penalize folks, right? You can you have the administrative and system powers not to accept people's memberships, right? To suspend folks, right? But make sure it's not about shaming them, right? It's about wanting to set an example for a club so that that club has the strongest supportership that it can have, right? It's a process of reconciliation. You're not trying to chase that person away. You're trying to show what the values are, right, of your supporter section. I want to thank everyone. I want to let folks know I'm around for more conversations, right? You can find me on Twitter. You can find me through ISC, but I really want to thank you for your time. I want to just say, right, for those of us who've been doing work against overt racism, right, what clubs, what supporters groups have done around the country has been really moving. And I don't think I can even begin to say thank you for standing up, right, in this moment, in the ways that you have, in the ways that you have spoken out, right, in the ways you've made visible. It has meant so much. And this workshop is a way to take that work deeper. It doesn't say that we don't need to still respond to these hate groups. We do. We need to take them seriously. But this is the way that we begin to build visions, right, of what we think America can be, who we think America is. And it's a way to visibly show our values in a way that I think competes against the white nationalist movement. It will show this country, the racial justice movement in this country has delivered more for white people, right, than the white nationalist movement ever has or ever will. Take one of these things and practice it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. At this time, guys, we are going to be switching over and we are going to do the next 30 minutes with just the ISC reps and guests. So if you are a public member joining us, thank you so incredibly much for joining us tonight. We will have this up for you to rewatch. And thank you so much. I'm going to give y'all a couple of minutes to clear it out, and then we will get going with just the ISC reps.